Origins of NATO and its foundational mission. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was born in 1949, forged in the early tensions of the Cold War. Its central mission was clear: to create a transatlantic alliance that could deter Soviet aggression and ensure peace and stability in Europe through the principle of collective defense. Article 5 of the treaty, declaring that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all, became the bedrock of Western security. But NATO was never just a military pact. It was also a political statement, affirming the shared values of democracy, rule of law, and mutual protection between North America and Europe. In its formative years, NATO provided an umbrella of deterrence that prevented Soviet expansion, anchored American military presence in Europe, and facilitated the reconstruction of war-torn nations under the Marshall Plan. It was a shield, a political club, and a strategic warning to the Kremlin. But over time, the strategic environment evolved, and so too did the alliance. Post-Cold War expansion and strategic shifts. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, NATO's original reason for existence appeared to vanish. But instead of fading into irrelevance, the alliance expanded its influence. Countries that had once been part of the Warsaw Pact or even the Soviet Union itself, like Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, and more recently Finland, chose to join NATO in pursuit of security and integration into the Western order. NATO's mission was redefined from deterrence to crisis management, peacekeeping, and cooperative security. It launched missions in the Balkans, played a key role in Afghanistan after 9/11, conducted anti-piracy operations, and partnered with non-member states across the globe. However, these new roles blurred NATO's identity. Was it a military alliance, a political institution, a humanitarian actor, or all of the above? And more importantly, could it remain cohesive while expanding its scope and membership? Internal frictions and burden-sharing dilemmas. While NATO's size and global presence grew, internal tensions simmered. The issue of burden sharing, particularly military spending, has long been a point of contention. The US, which provides the lion's share of NATO's defense budget, has repeatedly criticized European allies for not pulling their weight. The 2% of GDP defense spending goal, agreed upon at the 2014 Wales summit, remains unmet by several members despite increasing threats on the continent. This imbalance became a flashpoint under former President Donald Trump, who questioned NATO's relevance and even hinted at abandoning the alliance. European leaders responded by calling for greater strategic autonomy, suggesting that the EU should be able to defend itself independently. At the same time, Turkey's increasingly unpredictable behavior, purchasing Russian weapons, intervening unilaterally in Syria and Libya, and clashing with fellow NATO members, further strained unity. These tensions raise a profound question. Can NATO survive if its members diverge on their security priorities, political values, or definitions of threat? Russia's resurgence and NATO's strategic reawakening. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 marked a turning point. Suddenly, the core mission of NATO, deterring Russian aggression, was back at the center of global geopolitics. The invasion shocked Europe, reinvigorated NATO's purpose, and shattered decades of illusions about Russian intentions. NATO responded with unprecedented unity, deploying thousands of troops to Eastern Europe, reinforcing the Baltic region, increasing air patrols, and enhancing interoperability between allied forces. Finland joined the alliance in 2023, breaking with decades of military neutrality, and Sweden followed shortly after, dramatically expanding NATO's northern flank and dealing a strategic blow to Moscow. The war in Ukraine also prompted European nations to boost defense budgets, modernize equipment, and prioritize military readiness. Germany, long criticized for underfunding its military, announced a historic $100 billion investment in its armed forces. Eastern European nations like Poland and the Baltic states became major voices in shaping NATO policy, emphasizing deterrence and resilience. Yet despite these gains, the war exposed limitations. NATO has provided weapons, training, and intelligence to Ukraine, but avoided direct military engagement, revealing a line it will not cross. Moreover, the prolonged nature of the conflict has raised concerns about Western fatigue and the sustainability of support. Will unity hold if the war drags on? What happens if the U.S. changes its position under a new administration? Rising global challenges and the China question. As NATO reorients itself toward Russia, another giant looms: China. While geographically distant, China's economic, technological, and military rise has become a growing concern for the alliance. In recent strategic documents, NATO labeled China a systemic challenge, citing its assertive behavior in the Indo-Pacific, cyber capabilities, disinformation campaigns, and cooperation with authoritarian regimes. For the first time, NATO is forging closer ties with Indo-Pacific democracies such as Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. This reflects a recognition that security threats are no longer confined to geography. They span cyberspace, supply chains, space, and the digital domain. But this global focus is not without risks. Some European members argue that NATO should stay focused on defending Europe, not chasing global threats. The US, meanwhile, increasingly prioritizes competition with China, potentially diverting its attention and resources away from Europe. This divergence could lead to strategic drift within the alliance, undermining cohesion and clarity of mission. Technological transformation and next-generation warfare. NATO is facing not just geopolitical competition, but also a revolution in military technology. Future wars will be fought not only with tanks and fighter jets, but with algorithms, artificial intelligence, unmanned systems, space-based weapons, and cyber tools. Recognizing this, NATO has launched initiatives like the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, DIANA, and the NATO Innovation Fund to invest in disruptive technologies. Cyber defense has become a key domain of operations, with cyber attacks now considered possible triggers for Article 5. The alliance is also grappling with the implications of quantum computing, hypersonic missiles, and autonomous weapons. Yet keeping pace with innovation requires massive investment, institutional agility, and private sector collaboration, all of which are challenging for a bureaucracy composed of 32 member states with different priorities. If NATO cannot evolve technologically, it risks being outpaced not only by adversaries like China and Russia, but also by non-state actors and rogue regimes. Political will, public support, and the future of unity. Perhaps the greatest threat to NATO is not external, it's internal. The alliance is rooted in democratic values, but its unity depends on political will and public support. In an era of political polarization, economic hardship, and rising nationalism, sustaining transatlantic solidarity is not guaranteed. If European voters turn toward populist parties that oppose foreign entanglements, or if American voters choose a leadership less committed to international alliances, NATO could find itself adrift. There are already signs of shifting sentiment. In some Western countries, public support for military spending is fragile. Skepticism toward the US has grown in parts of Europe, especially after the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Meanwhile, countries like Hungary and Turkey have at times aligned more closely with authoritarian states than with their NATO partners. These internal contradictions raise uncomfortable questions. Can NATO maintain a unified voice in a fragmented political landscape? How does it deal with members who challenge its core principles? And what happens if a member state slides toward autocracy? Strategic choices in a multipolar and unstable world. We are entering a new era of multipolarity, where power is diffused, alliances are shifting, and the post-World War II order is under pressure. NATO must decide what kind of actor it wants to be. Should it focus narrowly on defending its territory from Russia? Should it evolve into a global security provider capable of confronting hybrid threats, pandemics, climate insecurity, and great power rivalry? Or should it transform into a broader coalition of democracies safeguarding not just borders, but values? Each path presents challenges: staying regional risks, strategic irrelevance; going global risks, overstretch. Defending values may lead to internal conflict with members who no longer fully uphold them. The future of NATO lies in its ability to adapt, not just structurally, but strategically and morally. It must define its purpose for the 21st century and align its capabilities, policies, and partnerships accordingly. That means investing in innovation, reinforcing deterrence, strengthening cohesion, and above all, remaining clear-eyed about the nature of the threats it faces.